testi. Testi, testi.
Testi. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, dear participants, it's 10 o'clock and it's time to begin our discussion, which deals with the European Parliament election and their implications for the EU. And we have here 4 panelists who are gonna inform us both about the election itself as well as about the potential consequences for the EU. Some of the topics that we thought we would cover today, of course, include the rise of the far right in the EP election. This was yet another EP election in which the far-right parties could strengthen their position within the European Parliament. We will also talk about the possible majorities in the next European Parliament and the future of coalitions within the EP. And of course, we will cover a topic that has made the headlines this morning as well, which is of course the division of the EU's top jobs and the results of the informal European Council meeting yesterday in the evening. And then we will talk also about the EU's political agenda and the priorities for the coming years as well. And then, of course, the idea is also to let you join in the discussion and bring up your own topics. So my name is Tuomas Isomarkku. I'm a senior research fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, and I will be chairing this session. And together with me on the panel today are Jarmo Oikarinen, on the right, head of the European Parliament office here in Helsinki. Then Manuel Müller, senior research fellow at FIA and our leading expert on EU elections and the European Parliament. And then here in the middle, we have Totti Sivonen, who is the executive director of Eurooppalainen Suomi, the European movement Finland. And then Hanna Tuominen, university lecturer at the University of Helsinki, where she also leads the master's program European and Nordic Studies. And I have asked all the participants to give short input statements of no more than 5 minutes, just their personal key takeaways from the EP election, as well as looking ahead towards the coming 5-year term of the EU. And Jarmo has agreed to start, so go ahead.
Thank you, Tuomas. And first of all, on behalf of the Parliament's liaison office here in Helsinki, I'm just very happy that we are able to organize this together with the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. This is always nice to work with the FIA, and this is a very opportune time to discuss the outcome of the elections. And I'm very happy to be part of this distinguished panel. Obviously, as someone who is working for the Parliament's Secretariat, I will have to make the usual disclaimer that we won't be talking with the political voice, but more with the institutional voice. But hopefully I can maybe add to the discussion a few points about how things are going. First of all, we have the elections now behind us, and that, of course, was quite a bit of work for us, and a major campaign, the second largest democratic elections in the world after the Indian elections, which took place in more or less in the same campaign period. The turnout Europe-wide was over 51%, which is the highest ever after the 2004 Big Bang of enlargement. So that was very positive. In Sweden and Denmark, our closest Nordic neighbors, the turnout was even higher than the EU average. In Finland, we lagged behind. That might be something for us in Finland to ponder going forward. What has happened after that is that last week the Conference of Presidents of the Parliament, the outgoing Parliament, met and discussed the election results, and on that basis there was a mandate for President Roberto Metsola to attend the informal summit of the heads of state and government yesterday, and basically the message that she gave to the summit was that the constructive center held in the elections, and of course, I mean, just looking at the numbers, of course, Parliament does not predict what will happen between now and the constituent session of the Parliament in the middle of July. But the projection, as it is on the basis of the election results and on the basis of what the Secretariat knows, the parties who came up in positions 1, 2, and 3 are exactly the same parties, same political groups that came up on those positions 1, 2, and 3 in the elections in 2019. So that kind of gives credit to to President Metsola's statement that the constructive center did hold. What will happen next is that obviously there was no conclusive decisions made in the informal European Council yesterday, but there will be another one, a more formal one, where the decisions are supposed to be taking place, as well as the strategic document for the next 5 years is intended to be adopted by the Council, and Parliament obviously will play a role in this. We're going to be a meeting between once again between the Conference of Presidents of the European Parliament and Charles Michel, the President of the European Council, already this coming Thursday, and then will be another meeting actually taking place before the next European Council next week. So on Wednesday there will be consultation between the Parliament and the Council on what is going to happen. And if all things work out, the Parliament has also indicated that there could be a consultation between the President-elect or the candidate for the President of the Commission, if the European Council is able to decide on the person already on the 2nd of July, so basically exactly in 2 weeks' time. And Parliament has also indicated that it is prepared to move ahead without delay in terms of election of the presidents. This is something obviously that in the context of the current international situation, it is something which seems to become more and more of a political priority to act fast. So we will have to wait and see, and what that action without delay will actually then mean, whether it will already mean action in July after the constituent session has started in Strasbourg on the 16th of July. But this is basically where we are at the moment, and we're waiting for things to happen. But I'll leave it there, and we can go ahead.
Thank you. And then Manuel.
Hello? Good. So, thank you very much. Maybe my main takeaway from these elections was that quite interestingly, the political groups in the European Parliament, which normally are not very present in the public discourse and in the media, were more present, at least this time, already before the election, because there was more talk than usual about possible majorities in the Parliament after the election and who would come first and so on. So I think this was kind of a positive development, that there was a bit more discussion about the actual political groups at the European level and not only on the national political parties. Of course, this interest in possible majorities in the European Parliament had a clear reason, which was the surge of the far right and the worries that existed, that how strong the far right would get in the European Parliament. I think this is partly where this interest came from. In the end, of course, the far right gained in numbers of seats, not for the first time. This is a development that already started in 2009, so basically with the Euro crisis. And since then, in every European elections, the parties to the right of the European People's Party have increased their number of seats. But of course, this time, even though these gains of the far right were not as strong as predicted based on the opinion polls before the elections, it is remarkable that the far right has reached an historical record high in the European Parliament, so never before far right parties have been that strong. And also, and maybe even more importantly, the far right now seems to start being part of this majority formation game. So looking at the results of the European Parliament elections, we can see that, of course, the constructive center, as Jarmo has called it, did hold. So the three biggest groups, the center-right European People's Party, the Social Democrats, and the Liberals, are still the three biggest groups, and they still have a clear majority in the Parliament, especially if we also add the Greens. So there is the political center is still having a comfortable majority. But the two important developments in terms of majority building is that so far there has been an alternative center-left majority based on the Social Democrats, Liberals, Green and Left, who were very close to a majority, and then together with defectors from other political groups or non-attached members, in some cases could build a majority during the last 5 years, which was important in climate policy, for example, or social and employment policy. And this center-left alternative majority doesn't exist anymore, so this will certainly be something that will change EU policy making over the next years. And then the other interesting development has been this debate about opening majority building to the right, which has mostly originated from the European People's Party, which has said that there should be a firewall, a cordon sanitaire towards the very far right, but that there are some parties within the two far right groups, the ECR and the ID, that one could cooperate with. And Manfred Weber, the leader of the EPP, came up with the 3 criteria of pro-European, pro-Ukraine and pro-rule of law as kind of a measure stick with which parties to cooperate. But then again, it sometimes has been very clear which parties the EPP actually considers to meet these criteria. They have been very clear on some specific parties, so in their view, the Italian governing party does meet the criteria, whereas the French opposition far-right party does not. But it's not in every case, it's completely clear who is seen as pro-EU by the EPP and who is not. And this then, of course, has led to many doubts and a lot of criticism by the center-left parties, the Social Democrats and the Liberals, who have said that they don't want to cooperate with any parties from the two far-right groups at all, and are trying to pressure now the EPP to also abstain from any cooperation, which then would basically mean that without a center-left majority and without any wish to cooperate with the ECR and the ID, basically the only majority option that would be left is this grand coalition of the constructive center, which is also an interesting development, because in the past we have always had this flexible majority building, and it could turn out that in the future the parties of the center, or the political groups of the center, will have to cooperate much more closer than in the past, because there aren't really any alternatives left. Well, the EPP, of course, is still in a way trying to introduce this opening to the right, at least punctually and with some parties. And it will be interesting to see over the next weeks and months and years how this develops further, and whether in the end there will be this opening and shift to the right, or this more compact political center.
Thank you very much, Manuel. And then we move to Totti.
Thank you. Yeah, as it has been established, it was sort of the center held its ground, while the far right also made considerable gains. And maybe to build on what Manuel was saying there on the far right and its gains, what was interesting to me was seeing that the sort of support among European youth for the far right, especially in Germany and France, has been increasing. I think in Germany there was around 10 points increase in the support for the AfD among youth aged 24 to 30, which is quite considerable. And also in France, the National Rally, I think, also increased its support from the youth by 10%. So these are quite significant numbers, and especially in France, the National Rally took around 30% of the youth vote, which is quite a considerable number. So it seems to me that there is sort of an increasing number of youth in Europe who have found their political home in the far right. It has been getting bigger. It's bigger since 2019, and it will probably continue to increase. And this will have, of course, effects for European politics, because political allegiances that are formed in the youth tend to last quite a long time. So I think it will definitely be a factor to play in the coming years, or if not decades to come.
Thank you, Totti. And then Hanna, please.
Okay, good morning. Also on my behalf, I will analyze the situation from the perspective of EU values, because that's based on my research and forthcoming edited volume on EU values. When I look at the elections, the starting point is that actually the European Parliament has been considered in research as the conscience of the EU. So this is quite interesting starting point. And secondly, if we think about the Parliament, it of course has democratic legitimacy as an institution. And I would say that the third point is that actually the EU citizens are quite eager to see European Parliament to act in value questions. So this would be my kind of starting point. But what does it mean that the Parliament is the conscience of the EU? I would say that it first overlooks that the EU values are respected and answers to breaches of common values through its resolutions and all that kind of statements and important actions. And secondly, it pushes other EU institutions to act if we see cases of violations. So if we think about the elections and the results of these elections, we can see that the moderate liberal center is shrinking, and then we can see more conservative, nationally oriented forces growing. And also Totti was speaking about the young people in Europe. We can see overall polarization also between young male and female voters, which is quite interesting. At least in Finland, we have seen a lot of results from this. So what does this polarization in value questions mean? We can take several examples, for example, gender equality questions, where the European Parliament actions have been quite strong. overall, more general equality questions, what kind of policies we will see if the coalitions are formed between the different forces. We can also see from the Nordic perspective interesting results, because in the Nordic countries the green and leftist parties actually had a defensive victory, and then we have the bigger EU states like Germany and France where we really see the support for the far right growing. So in that sense we can also see some kind of regional polarization in value questions. And of course, I have studied a lot of human rights, fundamental rights questions, so we can see also how these party positions on, for example, asylum and migration questions are getting more and more harsh, and how also the center parties are adopting more harsher positions on asylum seekers and how their fundamental rights are respected, despite the new package that was developed during the last term. And finally, well, I would have like several value questions here, but the rule of law questions were quite important during the last parliament term. So I think there are serious concerns that we hear when the more extreme forces are taking place nationally, but also in the European Parliament. So what happens with the media freedom and all that kind of stuff, and what kind of coalitions we will see here, and how these forces are getting stronger also in the parliament. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Lots of interesting topics that we could pick up here. Maybe I would just like to start with the election itself, and would like to hear your assessment on what were the things that really shaped this election. Manuel mentioned that the political groups were this time around more visible than probably in any previous EP election. Hanna talked about values, and actually those two things are probably connected. The political groups were so present because there were these widespread worries that the far right would become stronger, and that would challenge some of the EU's core values. But from your perspective, what were some of the topics that really shaped this election? Can we talk about European-wide, EU-wide topics, or do you still see that there was a lot of variety in the different member states? And then perhaps also the turnout question that Jarmo brought up. It was slightly higher than the last time, but also not substantially, even though there were expectations that this time around the voters would actually be more active. So just any one of you, your thoughts on these questions?
Should I start?
Sure.
Okay. Can you hear me? Yes? Well, if we think about European-wide issues, I think this time the left, Green and Social Democrats actually attacked the far-right parties and their policies on asylum and migration issues. And at least in Finland, we saw that it wasn't easy for the center or the EPP party, for example, to take its position, for example, on the Rwanda model, which caused a lot of complexities also in the Finnish election debate, because Prime Minister Orpo couldn't really make up his mind what is the position of the national coalition in Finland. And then there was a lot of debate, what is this Rwanda model actually, and should we follow it, and what does it mean? And then finally Orpo was speaking about cooperation with the third countries, which is, I would say, as a researcher, is quite different than the Rwanda model. So I think at least migration and asylum issues were very much debated all over Europe and also in Finland.
Yeah, if I could just add quickly to the migration, I think it's a bit odd that migration was such a big big deal in the EU elections, just because the numbers of migration have, if compared to the high years of 2015, they're really not that high anymore. But still, it's the number one sort of worry in the minds of many Europeans. So I think this is an interesting thing.
I would also agree that migration was, of course, a big issue in many countries. There were other shared issues too, like the discussion about climate change and the relation between climate protection on the one hand and agricultural interests on the other hand. In Finland, this was more about forestry interests, but it was basically the same debate, whether the Green Deal did go too far, or whether climate protection was still important and had to progress even more because climate change is still a big problem. So I think this was an issue in many member states. Then, of course, the war in Ukraine and foreign policy, although this debate looked very different through different national perspectives. So the question of what was actually at stake in the debate about the war in Ukraine was very different, because in some countries there are obviously parties who say we should end the war immediately and have peace negotiations with Russia, whereas in Finland this position is completely absent in the political discourse, and it was more about sending ground troops or not. So I think this was an issue in many countries, but it looked quite different from between countries. More generally, I would say that we could see over the last years kind of a polarization on value issues, which I usually describe as an opposition of more inclusivist and more exclusivist policies. Inclusivist meaning that there are some parties that are arguing that we should make policy for bigger groups of people. We should, for example, have transnational solidarity in mind, not only think about the own national citizenship, but also on a European or on a global level about other people, to have future generations in mind in climate policy, to have a more inclusive gender policy and so on. And these positions are typically associated with the Greens, left liberals, sometimes the left, so in general are more located in the center left. Whereas on the other hand, there is the more exclusivist position focusing rather on the own citizenship, on people living now instead of future generations and so on, which is a pole that is occupied by increasingly by the far right. And in 2019, the last European Parliament election, we could see that parties on both sides of this polarization were winning in vote at the expense of the traditional center parties. Whereas, since then, we have had two big crises. First, the pandemic, and then the cost of living crisis that followed from the war in Ukraine. And I think these two crises both hit ordinary people, citizens in Europe, quite hard, and made a lot of people suffer personally because things just became more difficult, and maybe were one of the reasons why this more inclusivist perspective, saying that, we don't think just about us, but also about the rest of the world and the future generation and so on, was not that convincing this time as the opposite position, saying that, no, we should care more about ourselves. I think this could be an explanation, of course, with a lot of nuances then in detail, but as a general explanation, I think this is something that could be true not only for some member states, but for the EU as a whole.
Yeah, I think the colleagues here, they've already brought up most of the things. From just a personal perspective, I 100% agree that if there was a European-wide discussion, then I think that there will much of the discussion also in the member states, certainly here in Finland, was also quite national in character, the way it was carried out in the public. But obviously there are these major moving trains to which the European Union will have to react and has already reacted. So there was a kind of a status quo, and where we are at the moment, and then one should look at what's going to happen in the future. One obviously is Ukraine, with all of its dimensions, from the situation at the front line, the question of supporting Ukraine, the possible reconstruction of Ukraine after hopefully the war will end at some point, and then the question of membership of Ukraine. And this, of course, have to do with the whole security domain in terms of EU's foreign and security policy. And then the second one is the issue of Europe's competitiveness in the world economy. There was also discussion in Finland, obviously, about and an ongoing discussion about how to attract investments, and that links with the issue of EU's finances and budgetary resources. Then the third one, obviously, is climate change. Manuel very well described, I mean, the political debate on that, but obviously we cannot control what actually happens in terms of the climate change. So that is also something where we might be just guessing what's going to happen and how our actions will actually influence climate change, and obviously that also has a linkage to the way economy works. And then the fourth one, maybe, I mean, the issue of migration, and also linked with aging of the European population. We have millions of Europeans leaving the labour market because of retirement in the coming decades. So I think these are maybe the big, like, but one could talk about them as megatrends, but major issues which certainly define the debate. But obviously there were a lot of different things in different member states, and the way these things were considered urgent, I mean, were different from one country to another.
Thank you very much. Then after now having discussed quite extensively the election itself, I would like to move on to talk about what's in store for us during the next 5 years. Maybe we'll start with the composition of the new European Parliament and what that then means in practice. Manuel already mentioned the kind of coalition options that are now being discussed, but how do you think that this situation in which the center still holds, as you say, but the far right is stronger than it has been previously, how do you think it will affect the day-to-day work of the European Parliament? How will it affect working in the committees? How will it affect working on some of the EU's key portfolios? Any insights on these?
I think one of the immediate effects has been that it has created a lot of mistrust within the political center and between the main parties of the political center, because of what I mentioned before, this temptation of the EPP to open towards the far right, or at least towards some parties of the far right, in order to maximize its own power position as the party at the center of the parliament, without which no majorities are possible. This has been met with a lot of mistrust by the center left, and of course mistrust within the political center that is needed to build majorities in the parliament is always a problem. So from my perspective, it would make a lot of sense now to focus on measures that can help to overcome this mistrust, which might be, for example, some kind of coalition agreement between the parties of the center, laying down some kind of common agenda and some kind of common working procedures and so on for the next 5 years. Of course, this is something that we didn't have so far in the European Parliament, because the European Parliament is known for its flexible majorities, and that all coalition building is pretty informal only. But I think this is something that might have to change under this effects of the rise of the far right, because the center has come under pressure, and the question whether the center will still work with its diminished majority. I mean, they still have a majority, but it becomes more complicated if there are more defectors and if there's more mistrust, and it becomes more difficult to build compromises. So I think a focus on making the center work for the next 5 years would make a lot of sense now. Of course, the problem with coalition talks is that they always take time. And right now there is a lot of pressure to get over with, for example, the nomination of the top jobs and to elect Ursula von der Leyen as Commission President as soon as possible. In my view, the political parties should not let themselves be put under too much pressure. Maybe it makes sense to shift the election of Ursula von der Leyen from July to September. To have some more time to work out how majorities can function over the next 5 years. But of course, this is a discussion that is going on right now in Brussels.
Yeah, but I don't want to predict the future in terms of the political makeup of the parliament, obviously. But maybe it's good to just maybe stress some of the points that Manuel already raised. Especially the fact that institutionally European Parliament is very different from most of the national parliaments, in a sense that there is no government opposition setting in the European Parliament. And that means, just like Manuel said, that the coalitions tend to be flexible, and even within a major legislative file, the majorities in the voting can change and shift. And this is something to keep in mind. That, I mean, usually the kind of coalition creation happens at the start of the legislature when it comes to these prominent positions, and now it seems that the European Parliament elections are going to have an effect not only in terms of the Commission President, but also other top jobs to a certain degree. So we'll have to wait and see how it works out. But when it comes to the actual work in the committees, what Thomas was asking, then of course, I mean, in most cases, I mean, you proceed by voting on amendment and by amendment, paragraph by paragraph, in terms of the text in front of the politicians. And you will always find a majority, because you vote for and against, and the majority always emerges. So in terms of Parliament's ability to act as a legislator, I do not see a major effect in terms of the election result. Obviously, politically, it can have different kinds of effects depending on how the political groups work with one another. In that sense, Parliament, in terms of functioning, is an easier institution because simple majorities are enough, whereas in the case of the Council, where the member states are convening and making decisions as the second chamber of the legislative process, they have the qualified majority decision making in most of the cases, which means that this kind of political diversity among the member states can have a much more of a functional effect on how things work out. But yes, I mean, we'll have to wait and see and how things will shape up from here to the middle of July and then going forward.
Yes, I would just add that we don't have to look only to the relationships between the political groups, but we have to look also inside the groups, because there are different kind of more conservative and more liberal forces inside the parties, and we have very different 27 national parties, and they try to kind of find compromises, and at the moment it seems that in the center some of the people are ready to accept more the kind of far-right opinions and mainstream their opinions, for example, in migration, but then others are not. So this is something that needs to be taken into account, and I think the main idea behind this is that some of the members think that if they adopt these positions, they can decrease the far right and support for the far right, but still it hasn't worked out that way. So I think that is one one of the big issues here. And I would say that Finland is quite an interesting example if you look at our government and how these parties actually manage to do cooperation in the government, because at least here we can see that overall they kind of agree on the Europe politics, but then we have seen a lot of surprises as well. So we never know what's up next. So I think in the future we will see more surprises in different issues.
Yeah, I'm also expecting more surprises in the future, definitely. And it was very interesting what Manuel said about the sort of growing distrust in the center. I think there's this sort of feeling that the EPP is maybe opening up towards the right there, which of course might not please, for example, the S&D. But I think there's a bit of ambiguity as to who we or what parties we characterize as far right and what don't we. For example, Meloni's party in Italy has been suppressing media freedom, which is very grave and I think very worrying trend in Europe. So this is definitely something to take into account too. I think, or I believe in the sort of survival of the Grand Coalition, with perhaps the Greens joining there. We'll see, obviously, but I think with the growing votes of the far right in Europe, the more traditional parties have to take this into account more and more. The sort of pressures coming from the far right.
Okay, there are still two bigger issues I would like us to tackle before we open up the floor for questions. First, yesterday there was the informal European Council, and no decision was taken so far. But how do you think this top jobs discussion is going to be like? It seemed before yesterday's informal European Council actually that a consensus would be emerging in record time, but now it may still take a bit more time. What are your expectations for that process? Are there any surprises there in store for us?
Yeah, I mean, we were expecting for a quicker agreement. I was reading the news yesterday, and then I saw this quote for some EU official or diplomat who said that there's always surprises in the top job debate, which of course happened. Now it seems like the EPP wants to divide the council presidency into a sort of EPP and S&D leaded terms. Hard to say what will happen. I think there's a lot of pressure to sort of quickly have an agreement on the matter for Europe to be sort of fully functional. So I'm hoping for the agreement to be coming soon.
Yes, I would also not be too worried at this stage. I've read the comment somewhere that these are head of states and government. They are not going to just rubber stamp anything, but they need to discuss everything and come up with something in order to feel important. It feels to me from what has happened yesterday that the EPP is trying to play its hand very strongly. Of course, they have won the election, and they are now the strongest party in all EU institutions. So Parliament, Council, and the upcoming Commission will probably also be dominated by the EPP. So of course they are asking for a bit more. On the other hand, the EPP will need cooperation with the Social Democrats, and yesterday they basically asked for positions that the Social Democrats expected to get for themselves. So it will probably not not play out this way, that the Social Democrats are just saying, well, okay, you can have the European Council presidency in the second half of the legislative term, but there will be some negotiations. In the end, I think what matters is that there is now a set of names that sounds very plausible to everybody, and there are basically no alternative names. So it's not like there is some sort of contest between different possible candidates for the positions, but basically it's the same set of names that is talked about again and again, and the discussions are more about the details. And I think this is a good sign that the European Council will then actually come to an agreement when they meet again in 10 days' time. Then the ball is in the European Parliament's court, and there, as I said before, I think it could make sense. Again, not to just rubber stamp things, but to take some time for some kind of coalition talks between the political groups of the center. But there too, I wouldn't expect any big surprises in the end. So the most probable development at this point is that the European Council will finally propose Ursula von der Leyen as Commission President, and the Parliament will in the end elect her. But it's, well, the nomination of the top jobs is always the best moment to also negotiate all other kinds of compromises. And of course, both the European Council and the European Parliament will take their time, and in the end they will come to an agreement.
Yes, and I would like to add that again, there are some like political interests and balance, but then again we need to think about also the regional concerns and regional balance in the top jobs. And then if I would add a third point is that again the gender balance is quite interesting again in the potential nominations and names that we see. And then finally, I would say that we have to look at the interinstitutional relations. So there is also the NATO-EU relations and the top jobs at the same time. So it's always a kind of play who gets what in the end, and how the regional interest, but also the political interest of the different parties are represented. So this is kind of difficult to negotiate in the end.
In terms of the timetable, maybe one way to contextualize what's happening now is to look at what happened in 2019. The elections then took place in the last week of May, basically 2 weeks before the date this year. And 2019, the European Council decided on its candidate to lead the Commission at the end of June. And so basically, if the informal European Council would have made the decision already this week, it would have been super fast compared to what happened in 2019. So in that sense, we are on course, and like I said, I mean, before already, European Parliament's Conference of Presidents of Political Groups have already met. They have agreement that the outcome of the elections is that the EPP is in the pole position. They also reiterated their support to the lead candidate process. And this obviously already gives a particular context from the point of view of the European Parliament as an institution. As I said, there will be a meeting between the leaders of the political groups and European Council's President Charles Michel on Thursday and again next week. And the first possible date for formal consultation between the proposed candidate to lead the Commission and the European Parliament's political groups is already on the 2nd of July. And we'll have to wait to see, I mean, how things will evolve. The other thing, I mean, fully agree with Hanna that, I mean, obviously there are different considerations in the play in terms of gender balance and also geographical balance. But it's also quite interesting to look at the way the political balance will play out even more widely in not just regarding the Commission President, but more widely in terms of how the top jobs are shaped. I mean, because you have to remember that in 2019, not only the Commission President became EPP, the High Representative came from the S&D, and the European Council went to Renew. So the three top political groups in the Parliament were represented also in these political top jobs. And also when you look at the current Commission, Mrs. von der Leyen obviously comes from the EPP, Mr. Timmermans came from the S&D, and Mrs. Vestager came from the Renew. So not just the Commission President, but also the number 2 and number 3 in the Commission were in line with the results of the Parliament election in 2019. So this might be something to keep in mind when we're looking at how things will unfold in the coming weeks.
Thank you. There's still one matter that I would like to take up before we let the audience ask questions, and that's of course the main political issues and priorities for the next 5 years, and how do you see this election result as impacting those? To what extent do you think that the EP elections have shaped or will shape the EU's upcoming agenda? Let's have a short round of comments and then open up for questions from the audience.
Yeah, I think the defining themes during the next 5 years will be the themes that were talked about in the election quite a lot. So defense, security, and migration, of course. I mean, there was the sort of political priorities draft list, which was leaked during the spring from the Commission. I think it mentioned environments one time, and it was in the context of a business-friendly environment. So I think this sort of signals that there's a sort of exhaustion into environmental legislation in the EU, and this I think will influence the next 5 years. I don't think it's going to disappear altogether. I think it's going to stay there. I just don't think it will be sort of talked about as much. But for example, the Draghi report, which is bound to come soon, Draghi was speaking about it, and there was this sort of idea on the European industrial policy and having a sort of carbon-free energy system at the heart of it. So I think the green transition will stay in the important topics, but just it won't be talked about as much.
Yes, I would also agree that the climate issues are more interest-based, and of course we have discussed a lot about security issues, but at least in Finland we tend to think security as a comprehensive or wider security, and then it's of course related to food security, different kind of preparedness, which was also due to the COVID pandemic, and all these kind of things. So I think the approach to climate issues is more securitized, and also to the competitiveness, we need to think about climate issues there, and also then, of course, internal stability and peace inside the EU between different groups when there's more and more polarization. This is also one quite important aspect of internal security, and I think in Finland we didn't discuss much about social justice or just transition during the election debates, but elsewhere in Europe I think these topics were quite prominent. So in that sense, maybe these issues will come up. So let's see.
Well, I agree with all the things that you have mentioned. I think that these will actually be the ones that will be very big on the agenda for the next years. I would just add one more point, which is the issue of enlargement and reform, because of course the EU has basically promised the candidate countries in the East that once they are ready and fulfill the Copenhagen criteria for accession, the EU is going to be ready too. And that means that the EU has to reform internally, and of course there is a big debate going on as to how far these internal reforms have to go. And I think this is a debate that, because of course reform is so cumbersome and always requires unanimity, and then you have to think a lot about how you can build compromises that enable this unanimity, or whether it will be some kind of differentiated reform and so on. So it's a very complicated issue. So if the EU wants to be ready for enlargement by the end of the decade, the discussion basically has to start right now. And of course, the European Parliament election as such, I think, does not fundamentally change this debate, because what we said several times, the center did hold, and the political parties of the center are the ones that are basically working together on these issues. But in a broader sense, I mean, the gains of the far right in this European Parliament elections are only representing a general trend that we have seen also in national elections, and especially in the formation of national governments. There are more and more national governments at the European level with far-right parties participating, and this also implies national populist and Eurosceptic parties participating in government in ever more countries, which of course makes debate about reform all the more complicated. So I think this will be an important issue, which is why it will be there, but it will also be a very thorny issue, which may be why the political actors will not be very happy to deal with it, because it will require a lot of work to have any progress in this context.
Yeah, well, I mean, the outgoing European Parliament has been very strong on supporting Ukraine also in this path to membership, also with the other candidate countries' path to membership. Has also been very forthright in terms of looking forward and toward a possible change in the basic treaties. This is quite clear also in during the past legislature's proceedings. However, one has to, of course, remember that while the European Parliament is an important player in terms of creating the European political reality, the decisions on the revision of the basic treaties are in the hands of the member states, and they are clearly in the driving seat when it comes to the possibility of a real reform in this sense. Otherwise, I would just simply recommend everybody to read the statement of President Roberta Metsola in the informal council yesterday in terms of the themes. I mean, many of them also mentioned here by the colleagues in the panel.
Thank you. And now is the moment for your questions. So please, if you have questions, we'll take perhaps 3 or 4 questions, and since we have still around half an hour time, I think we can take a couple of rounds of questions. But I see at least 2 hands there.
My name is Risto Veltheim, I'm a former diplomat. Thank you very much for a very interesting discussion on the results of EP elections. If you had asked me what was the major result of EP elections, I would have said it's the collapse of Macronism, the collapse of French President Emmanuel Macron and his party. Rassemblement National won in the elections 30%. Now the polls give them 35%. The French government after the parliamentary elections will be completely different. If, for instance, Macron has to ask Jordan Bardella to form the new government, then we will have a new Orban on the shores of Atlantic. So my only conclusion is that the big loser of these elections was, unfortunately, Ukraine. You mentioned, many of you, that EPP kept the power and the majority, but they have to take this situation much more into consideration in all future decisions. Unfortunately, this is my analysis of the situation. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, there was no question there, but I'm sure this is something that you can comment on. And there was another hand, I think, also back there.
Thank you. Joachim Kullas from Uusi Suomi newspaper. If EPP gets 2.5 years to chair the European Council, who is the most likely candidate for the job? And the second question is, how certain is von der Leyen's second term? Some people say there's no drama, but there are other kinds of talks about that also. Thank you.
I think we could still take 1 or 2 questions more if there are more questions. But I don't see any more hands, so we'll just start with these 2 big topics. So Macron, and then also von der Leyen's second term, and the possibility of a president of the European Council from the EPP for 2.5 years.
Okay, yeah, well, the collapse of Macronism, I would say that Macron represents a visionarist European position, and that's actually the main loser here. So I think the status quo is maybe continuing, and instead we see a lot of other kind of forces, but then of course we have to think about the national rally and how it succeeds to influence inside the European Parliament, in the ID group, or what kind of groups there will be, and that's the main question in Europe. And of course also if we think about the national situations, they always influence more on the European politics, of course, than the European Parliament. So we will see, but of course, I would say that the visionarist European thinking is losing here, and maybe Ukraine as well.
Yeah, I mean, Macron has had a pretty rough night on the election, and is going to have a rough few months ahead of the snap elections, especially as it seems as the French left is uniting. So this is digging dirt under Macron's feet. So it's bad news for him, and also, as Anna said, pretty terrible news for the sort of visionary idea of Europe. As for the candidate of the EPP. I don't really know. I read somewhere that it could be the Croatian PM, but I cannot remember his name right now.
About Macron, I agree that 5 years ago, in the 2019 elections, there were basically 2 big winners, the Greens and the Macronist camp, so some kind of social, liberal, cosmopolitan vision. And of course they were the losers in this election, although it must be reminded that both the Greens and the Liberals are still at historically quite good levels. So I think for the Greens this was the 2nd best European election in their history, after 2019, of course, and for the Liberals it was the 3rd best European election result. So it's not like this has completely plummeted. But of course in France, for Macron, he is in big trouble, and I think he took now a great gamble with this early elections. Maybe it will pay out. I mean, when we look at the French campaign right now, we see that also the right and the far right are having a lot of trouble now building alliances and so on. It could be that in the end the big winner will be the left camp, who have been very quick in allying. But of course, it's very, very open, everything, and we will only know more once the election is over. And then I think it is also a very important and correct point to look at the government formation and the importance of the national member state governments in the Council for European policy making. Because of course we are now focusing on the European Parliament election because it has just taken place, but the Council is at least as powerful as the Parliament on all decision-making issues. And if the far right gains in the Council by participating in more member state governments, this will also have an impact then on European policy. With regard to the EPP candidate, well, I think it would be a lot of guesswork to come up now with anything. I'm not entirely sure whether the EPP actually is completely serious about this claim of having this position, or whether it's more of a bargaining chip in the discussion in order to put some pressure on the Social Democrats not to be too complicated on some other issues. So I think it is still in a big bargaining phase. It could be that in the end the EPP will get this position in the second half of the 5 years. But I think it is really very early to speculate here.
And then we still have had also von der Leyen's re-election chances.
Oh yes, in this context I think that her chances are actually quite good, mainly because of the lack of an alternative. There, of course, there has been some talk about Mario Draghi before the election, and one could always come up with some surprise candidate, the way that Ursula von der Leyen herself was a surprise candidate 5 years ago. But on the other hand, the EPP wants this position. She has been the EPP lead candidate in the election. The other political group in the parliament are in principle also in favor of the lead candidate procedure. So I think on the side of the parliament there are good reasons not to block her. And on the side of the European Council, well, most member states have worked quite well with her over the last 5 years. So there are a few, mostly Viktor Orban, who is complaining, but this is not probably not where, you know, Viktor Orban is not the one who is going to convince all the others that they should follow his lead. So I think in the European Council there is rather an interest not to complicate matters, and this all in all would bring me to the expectation that in the end they will nominate Ursula von der Leyen and the parliament will elect her, although of course a lot can still happen because all the bargaining is still going on.
Very briefly, on France, not to in any way go against what the colleagues have said here before, but it's also good to remember that the French political system is a presidential system which gives the president very, very strong authority, including the possibility of calling the snap legislative elections, but these are legislative elections, not presidential elections. It means that Macron will stay in the European Council as the representative of France, as the president of France. Regarding von der Leyen, I just go back to what was discussed in the Conference of Presidents of Political Groups of the European Parliament last week, and what President Metsola stated yesterday in terms of the political groups of the Parliament, agreeing that the EPP as a political group has won the elections, and their commitment to the lead candidate process. I think that already tells quite a lot about what would be the Parliament's stance in this regard.
Okay, do we have more questions from the audience at this point? Yes.
Hello. My name is Hannah Welland. I'm from the Embassy of Sweden here in Helsinki. I have 2 questions, if I may. The first is what you think of the prognosis or the possibilities to go from discussion to action of a new EU charter, for example, that have been discussed both in Finland and Sweden, the willingness of the national governments to go from consensus to qualified majority when it comes to the common security and foreign policy within the EU. So that is the first question. And the other question is relating to some issues that have been prioritized on the Finnish side when it comes to both defense security, but also comprehensive security and civil preparedness, as the Finnish government has launched the initiative for a preparedness union within the EU. What do you think about the coming 5 years when it comes to these issues, a more comprehensive view of security, and will the member state be able to agree on this issue and work on a more on an EU level and not only when it comes to national competence, including economic security and issues on strategic dependencies, for example? Thank you.
Thank you. And do we have other questions still? No, at this point, no other questions. So maybe I'll just add one. So we have already been talking about France here and the potential possible political changes in France and how that affects the EU. Then we also have Germany. I think the results for the German government were also quite significant for its role both in domestic politics and at the EU level. But is there something that you would like to comment on that as well? So maybe we'll go with these 3 questions for now. You can also just pick one if you like.
Yeah, I could take the preparedness union and Finnish policy. Preparing is very difficult, and it's very difficult to get the kind of general support for this kind of policy because it's so much in the future. And of course, we have seen a lot of issues also in the Finnish debate about the economic security and how EU-level agreement could be reached on these topics because we have so different regional interests and member states' interest in economic issues and how the budget will be developing in the future. But I would also raise the question of EU-level agreement on harder security issues. So, of course, the defense policy and how we deal with investments and all this research and other kind of development, how we support the development industry and how to agree on EU level that we can really prepared to future crises together. So I don't speculate how to deal, but I think this is one of the topics that needs to be discussed a lot during the next term. So I think this is a very good agenda for Finland to try to discuss about the preparedness because we do have a lot of background and experience of this and of course all the questions as I said, concerning comprehensive security are very important also internally if we think about the internal security and polarization within the EU and different national member states societies. So in that sense, very important theme.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, Finland has been pushing for the notion of comprehensive security for quite a long time, and I think that they've sort of sniffed an opportunity to push it even further with the preparedness union. Now that security is a large piece of debate and discussion in the EU. So I think it's the best chance so far to sort of push forward the preparedness aspect.
Yeah, also because Finland is seen as a role model in this. In this matter by many EU member states, so it could at least influence the discussion, although then passing from talking to action, of course, is always difficult because it is well, because in general, EU policy making is difficult because you always need to have a majority not only in the parliament but also in the council, and in the council it's always at least a qualified majority if it isn't unanimity. So of course this makes things difficult even when you basically have a majority agreeing on something, which brings me to the next point, the issue of qualified majority voting, which of course is related to the question of enlargement and reform, which I mentioned earlier. I think the European Parliament has been very clear on this. They came up last year with their proposals for treaty reform, which are very far-reaching, and the European Parliament has well, basically made clear that it is in favor of majority voting on all issues, so that there should basically be no veto rights for member states left in any regard, which of course would be good for the EU's capacity to act, and in my view also for the EU democracy, because it would make democratic majority decisions more prominent at the European level. But of course it will be difficult to have an agreement on something like this among the member states, which is necessary for treaty reform. So maybe it's more plausible that in the end there will be some much less far-reaching agreement that very likely will focus on foreign and security policy, because this is where we have the most agreement among member states. Even there are still several governments who do not want to see any of this, but it could be that there will be at least some potentially with some differentiated construction, but at least some agreement to proceed on more foreign qualified majority voting. With regard to Germany, of course, there have been a lot of discussions now going on in Germany about the electoral results and what that means for the government, because all the government parties lost big. And there has been a lot of infighting among the German coalition parties even before. And now all of them basically are drawing the conclusion that they must well, be more successful in having their own policies implemented. So there will, it's quite likely that there will be even more infighting also over the next months. And of course, there are regional elections coming up in Germany in some of the Bundesländer. And in these regional elections, the far right is again expected to win big, and there might be even problems with regional government formation. So it's quite likely that this kind of crisis debate is going to go on in Germany over the next months. And then, of course, next year is already the next federal election. There has been some talk now about the possibility of anticipated federal elections, but I think this is very unlikely. First, because in Germany there is no tradition of dissolving the parliament. It has been done very, very rarely. It's also a complicated procedure to do it legally. And then with the regular federal elections already next year, I think it's more likely that we will see political parties switch in campaign mode quite early, and it remains to be seen how much the federal government is able to agree on and actually implement before the elections. This, of course, is also a certain risk for Ukraine. Because, for example, the German Social Democrats, who are of course leading the government, have lost many votes now in the European Parliament election to a new left-wing populist party, well, left-wing nationalist populist party that has been that has a clear focus on the idea that we should have peace negotiations with Putin right now. And of course, seeing many of their voters defect to a party that is very open in campaigning for this might have an impact on the Social Democrats too. So they might think, well, maybe we should talk more about peace. And of course, this has been a position that has been present among the German Social Democrats even before. So it could be that there will be internal discussions also within the government parties about how much aid for Ukraine can still be explained to the national electorate, although in the end the German government as such, of course, is very much in favor of continuing supporting Ukraine. So it's rather a discussion with the electorate and doubts about how to convince the voters that this is the way to keep on. So I think things may become more complicated in Germany, although the government as such is quite certain to be, well, trying to do as much as it thinks can be presented to the national public on this issue.
On the EU basic treaties, of course, I mean, in the longer perspective, one can say that in the 1980s, 1990s, early 2000s were very active in terms of EU basic treaty changes. Basically, there was a treaty change in every election cycle, but there hasn't been one since 2009 and the Lisbon Treaty. And like Manuel said, I mean, European Parliament worked on this, the Constitutional Affairs Committee, and then finally plenary adopted Parliament's position. But of course, I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, this is in the hands of the member states what to do about that. The Parliament has very far-going proposals in its position regarding the qualified majority voting. But if I'm correct, I'm not an expert on the Council decision making. But I think that in the area of common foreign and security policy, the going towards more qualified majority voting is actually does not require a treaty change, but at the initiative of the High Representative for CFSP, it is possible for the member state to go for qualified majority voting. It just has not been the practice, but that's already in the Lisbon Treaty. I mean, you have to fact check this, but I think that's the way it works. So I think that, and if I'm correct, I mean, Finland and Sweden have been in part of this Germany-led group which has been discussing the qualified majority voting in CFSP. But I think that from the positions of the outgoing parliament, one could decipher that the parliament certainly would be in favor of that. But one has to see how things come up when the new parliament gets organized. On Germany, I will just only mention the fact that 64%, so almost 2/3 of the German electorate voted. Turnout 64% in the elections, and if you take that into account and then you add to that Sweden 53%, Denmark 58%, so we're talking about our closest reference countries in terms of to whom we in Finland like to compare ourselves to. And if you then put the Finland's 40.4% overall, 42.4% for those resident in Finland, we are way back compared to not only Sweden and Denmark, but especially compared to Germany. So that might really be a reason for the different actors in Finland to get together and see, I mean, what's going on here.
Thank you. We still have 10 minutes, so it's time for the last questions. Any questions still from the audience? No? Then I'll take advantage of my position as chair and ask one last question, and that relates to what is ahead of us. So, of course, we enter here the realm of speculation. But when do you expect the next European Commission to start its work, and what are perhaps still the big and tricky issues that await us in the coming months? So, just a look at our immediate future. What do you see there?
well, the regular timeline for the Commission to take office would mean that they start in November, December, maybe even only in January, because of course the nomination of the Commission itself takes a lot of time. Because first we need to have the top jobs issue sorted out that we talked a lot about before. The Commission President has to be elected, and then the member states can formally propose commissioners. Then the Council has to adopt the list of commissioners. This is basically a rubber stamping exercise. And then it goes to the Parliament, and the Parliament has its hearings. And it has been the case in all European Commission nomination procedures in this century, I think, that the Parliament has rejected at least one of the proposed commissioners. Last time it was even 3, one of each political group. There was also some kind of quid pro quo in this context. And I think it's not inconceivable that we will have something like this again, that the European Parliament will not be happy with all the proposals made by the member states. So a new commissioner will then have to be proposed and so on. So this is still a long procedure. That will basically take the autumn, and then I would expect, depending on how quick it goes, first with the top jobs and then with the commissioners' hearings, to have the Commission take office at some point in winter. And of course, you mentioned it before, the gender balance will also be quite a challenge for the Commission. I have been looking for my blog at the national debates about who might be the commissioners from each country. There are some countries where this is still completely open because, for example, there have just been elections in Belgium and Bulgaria, and they are still forming a government that will then propose the commissioner. But there are other countries like Finland where we basically already have clarity because the government has already said who is going to be the Finnish commissioner, in this case, Inna Virkkunen. So the debates are in different places right now, but looking at them and trying to get an impression of the overall picture, it emerges that a lot of the proposed commissioners will come from the EPP. The center-left will probably lose influence in the next commission, but also that a lot of the names that are discussed are male. And of course, the Commission presidents in the past have always tried to convince member state governments to put forward more women in order to have a more gender balanced commission. Last time this worked out actually quite well. The last commission was pretty gender balanced, but it remains to be seen whether this is the case also this year, and well, how much negotiation with member state governments it will require in order to well, have a more or less gender balanced commission, because of course this is also important for the European Parliament, and the Parliament is probably not going to accept a commission where this balance doesn't exist.
Yeah, not much to add to Manuel's very extensive answer. If you're looking for a date and perhaps a time, I would say December 12th at 3:30 would be my educated guess.
Excellent.
Yes, as a researcher, I don't speculate. But one thing that I find quite interesting is the portfolios of the commissioners, because last time there was a debate about this commissioner on the defender of European way of life. So in a way, what kind of debates we have about the names and portfolios of the commissioners, not to mention defense industry commissioner and that potential position. So I think this could be quite interesting to me to kind of follow what kind of debates are now conducted on the portfolios and their contents.
Well, I hope you don't expect me to, as a civil servant, to match Totti's precision in terms of the date and time. But what I can repeat is to say, I mean, what the Parliament's Conference of Presidents of Political Groups and President Metsola have stated, that the Parliament stands ready to move without delay when the candidate for the president of the Commission has been deciding in the European Council, and obviously thinking about the overall context in Europe, the urgency of the challenges that are at hand, not only Ukraine but also otherwise. I think that will probably mean that to try to match the schedule to what happened in 2019 is not out of the question, but of course everything depends, just like Manuel said, depends on the political process. This is a political process, and it starts now first at the European Council with the heads of state and government, and see how well they can make their minds up in terms of the top jobs, as well as with the strategic document for the next 5 years. And considering the makeup of the European Council, the heads of state and government, I mean, they are leaders. If we just look at the top 6 largest member states, I mean, there are several political groups and affiliations represented there. So if they can agree on something, I mean, then it's not unthinkable that things could go quite swiftly as well. But this is politics, and it has to be given its time to happen.
Thank you very much. It's now 11:30, and it's time to close this discussion. But I would like to thank all the panelists for their excellent contributions. Also, thanks to the audience for showing up, and thanks to our viewers of the live stream. This discussion is now closed. Thank you very much.